So after the presentation from Vicente on the dark side of sulfur compounds, let's move on the bright side with sulfur-containing compounds that contribute positively to the wine aroma. Amongst all the positive sulfur-containing compounds, you know that 3 aroma compounds are well studied for years because of their very potent odorant power. Those compounds are the so-called varietal thiols, the 4-MMP, 4-mercapto, 4-methylpentanetone with box-tree and blackcurrant bud scent, the 3-MH, 3-mercaptohexanol, grapefruit and passion fruit odors, and its acetates, the 3-MHA, with passion fruit odors. Those compounds have been identified in several white, rosé, and even red wines. You have some variety that have been identified in. But also, we have noticed that those compounds are present in other products, alcoholic beverage like beer, and from hops in this case, cider, and also in fruit juices like tropical fruit juices. What is the contribution to those compounds to the aroma of the wine, the global aroma profile? I give you here the example, a case of study on New Zealand Sauvignon, where the research team investigated the contribution of 3 compounds, 2 thiols, 3-MHA and 3-MH, which are very abundant in these wines, and also the 3-isobutylmethoxypyrazine, the bell pepper responsible aroma compounds, for their contribution to modulate the aroma profile of the wine. And they proved that 3-MHA was responsible for the tropical fruit notes of those Sauvignon wines, whereas for the passion fruit note, a very pleasant note, you must have 3-MH, 3-MHA, and even the pyrazine for the green note of this particular fruit. And obviously, pyrazine is responsible for the green note of asparagus and also bell pepper in this kind of wines. In other wines, like in Provence rosé wine, where thiols are much lower level, we identified an interaction between thiols and ester, and the ratio between the balance between thiols, 3-MHA and 3-MH, and esters, fermentative ester level, could explain 3 of the 4 aroma profiles that are distinguished in the rosé Provence. In the classical rosé wine, you have high level of esters and low level of thiols, with the typical fermentative and amylic profile. When with the grape origin and the convenient winemaking techniques, you succeed in having high level of esters in comparison to high level of thiols, sorry, in comparison to esters. You have the appearance of the thiolic notes with box-tree, green, grapefruit notes. And what is very interesting is that with a good balance between thiols and esters, this balance is responsible for the most appreciated aroma profile for rosé wines, that is to say the tropical fruit aroma profile. So it's very interesting to have, but very difficult, we will see it after, to have this good balance between the 2 families of compounds. In terms of biogenesis, you already know that those thiols are not present in grapes as free form, but as precursors, different families of precursors, and all those precursors are cleaved, liberated by the yeast during fermentation. The first precursors identified were the cysteinylated conjugate, then the glutathionylated conjugate, and recently we identified also dipeptides derived from glutathione that are conjugate to 3-MH and 4-MMP. There is also another way throughout the unsaturated C6 compounds that give rise to 3-MH during fermentation. Those precursors are responsible for the formation only of 4-MMP and 3-MH, and for the 3-MHA, it's the classical acetylation by the yeast that is responsible of the conversion from the alcohol to the acetates. This conversion is very important in terms of aroma because it changes the aroma profile from grapefruit to passion fruit, but also because of the increase in aromatic intensity because of the lower perception threshold of A3MH in comparison to 3MH. A3MH, in fact, is 15 times more powerful than 3MH. And to give you a concrete idea of the potency of the compound, you need only 20 drops of the pure A3MH in order to transform the water of an Olympic swimming pool into passion fruit juices. So very potent aroma compounds. You have to eliminate the chlorine before because it's not possible. What are the importance of the different pathways for the formation, in this case, of 3MH? We have told of cysteinylated, glutathionylated conjugates with, for this kind of compounds, aldehyde form and SO2 adducts. And recently, we identified the gamma-glucis and cis-gly 3MH, and we have also the C6 compounds pathway. If we have a look of the percentage of origin, you can see that the major part of 3MH is formed by cysteinylated or glutathionylated precursors, but dipeptides have roles, and even hexanal and hexanal could play a role in the formation. But if we sum up all the percentage, we reach only 45%, so a large part of 3MH origin is still unexplained and need to be investigated. Whatever, with those different forms, we have good markers of the aromatic potential of grape and must before fermentation. When we speak about cleavage, in fact, we speak about two mechanisms, different mechanisms. The cleavage is performed by the yeast, but it's only an internal enzymatic activity. So for this reaction, the yeast has to uptake the precursors into the cell, and so the first reaction is the entrance of the precursors into the yeast with the role of different transporter and many regulation on this transporter. And the second step of the cleavage is the cleavage itself with several genes that have been identified and two main genes for the final cleavage step that are ER7 for 4-MMP and STR3 for 3MH. And again, we have those genes, but also all the regulation of their expression during the fermentation that are key points in the thiol revelation. In terms of transport, the first transport way identified was the general aminopermease that is able to transport cysteinylated conjugate into the yeast. And this transport is well known to be repressed by the presence of ammonia in excess throughout the nitrogen catabolic repression. So we will see after that nitrogen nutrition is very important in terms to ensure a good transport of the precursors into the cells. For the glutathionylated conjugates, OPT1 seems to be the major transporter, but some other transporters like FOT1 and FOT2 are also involved. And for the deep peptides, we are thinking about the small peptides transporter like DL5 and PTR2 that can be involved in the transportation of the precursors. So a very complex panorama, and in addition, we can also have a secretion of those precursors, especially the glutathione 1, throughout the JEX1 transporter, which is responsible for the balance of glutathione and the redox balance due to the presence of glutathione in the cell, in the yeast cell. The problem with those complex transport steps is that we haven't many clues on the regulation, except for GAP1, and of the yeast diversity for this, the presence of all those transporters. So could be a very important step and a very limited step in order to have an efficient cleavage of thiols during fermentation. To what extent can we control the thiol release? My presentation will speak on a global control. Indeed, as for all the varietal thiols, those compounds are present as precursors in grapes, and all the work begins in the vineyards. After that, pre-fermentative fermentation play a key role. Fermentation conditions, obviously, with the yeast cleavage are essential. And as Vicente present, thiols are very reactive species. So all the post-fermentative conditions, especially oxygen dissolution, can be very important in order to preserve the released thiols. In terms of vineyards, two main factors have been investigated. The date of harvest with very inconsistent results. Normally, winemakers consider that early harvests are favorable for thiols in the wines, but in fact, it depends on the pedoclimatic condition of the area. And I give you a counter example. It's on the left. You can see that in this area, that is to say southwestern France, late harvest give always wines with a high level of thiols, but it's a very rainy area, quite cold and rainy area. The other aspect is the water status of the wine, and in this case, some consistent results that indicate that a moderate water stress is more favorable to the accumulation, especially for 4-MMP. Other mean in order to pilot the contents of thiols in the wine, but starting working in the vineyard, is the fertilization and the nitrogen fertilization. And indeed, even if the most used technique is fertilization in soils, we consider that foliar nitrogen spraying could be a very efficient technique because it's a versatile technique. And you can see here that these techniques, that is to say spraying urea at the virizen time, is very interesting in order, on the left graph, to increase the YAN of the grapes. And consequently, you also increase, and with a high increase, we are 5-7 times higher, you increase the thiols in the corresponding wines. So a very potent tool in order to increase the thiols. What is the mechanism of this, this effect? In fact, we not systematically identify an increase in terms of precursors level, but what we identify is a change in the nitrogen ratio in the YAN. That is to say that urea and foliar nitrogen spraying favors the accumulation of amino acids in the grapes and in comparison to ammonia. So you change the balance between amino acids and ammonia in the YAN. After harvest, you have normally succeed in having high level of precursors in your grape. The first step is to be able to extract them. Those precursors are, as many precursors are present in the skin of the berries, and you can see here the difference between the different precursor variety, the repartition between skin and pulp. So all the operations that can favor the extraction of skin components into the juice during the must elaboration are favorable to the thiol contents of the wine. In these techniques, skin maceration, of course, and also the use of extraction enzymes in order to speed up the diffusion mechanism. The other very important step in the pre-fermentative operation is linked to the must elaboration and to the oxidation during the pressing. You know well the major reaction occurring during must oxidation, and that is responsible for the must browning. That is to say the oxidation of hydroxynamic acid, mainly caphtoric acid, by PPO and oxygen. That led to the formation of quinones, and those compounds are very reactive and enters in chain reaction, leading to the formation of brown pigment. In this pattern, glutathione play a key role because it's a trap order to block the quinone and to block the further oxidation reaction, leading to the so-called grape reaction product. Glutathione is also responsible, and we will see some highlights on it, and the residual glutathione after the major reaction is also able to add onto hexanal formed in all the must by oxidation of unsaturated lipid. And this addition led to the glutathionylated 3-MH. So you could increase the potential, the thiol potential, if you are able to preserve some glutathione in your must. And of course, the residual glutathione is also important because it's one determinant of the level of glutathione in your future wine. The reaction between glutathione and hexanal is detailed here. It's a simple addition, and after a reduction step, you have the real thiol precursors. Here in simple terms. In the reality, we observe this increase in glutathione in comparison, comparing traditional and inert gas pressing. You can see that in terms of cysteinylated precursors, we didn't see any difference between the two types of pressing system. But in terms of glutathionylated precursors, you can see that for the two last experiments, where we perform for the inert gas a totally inerted pressing, you can see that in this case, we have lower level of G3MH in the inert gas system than in the traditional system. That is to say that the traditional system, it was a pneumatic press, not low temperature grape, so traditional but very well controlled. In this case, the moderate oxidation that occurs in the traditional press system is favorable to the thiol precursors. Always in the pre-fermentative operation, cold stabilization of the must, you know that this is stabulation and not stabilation. So the storage of the must on the lees for weeks, and we observe always that there is an increase of 3MH and 4-MMP the wines, even we are not able to see any increase with the, in the precursors we are able to measure. So we haven't the explanation of this increase, but it's systematically observed. So a very potent tool in order to defend the fermentation, but also to increase the aromatic quality of the wine. Obviously, fermentation is the key step because it is the step where occur the cleavage. Different ability of the yeast to release thiols. You know that the yeast are not all equal in terms of thiol release. And also an effect of the temperature. High temperature are favorable to the release of thiols. High temperature are 18, 20 degrees for white winemaking. In terms of yeast, we usually distinguish two types of yeast. The releaser yeast that are able to have a very good yield in terms of cleavage and produce high level of 3MH and 4-MMP. And here you can see that even with high releaser yeast, we can have differences between 3MH and 4-MMP ability. So 4-MMP, it's a very specific reaction, and very few yeasts are able to release high level of 4-MMP. What is very important also is to convert the 3MH into A3MH, and yeast is even obviously able to do it with different ability. You have here the ratio, and what is very interesting is that blend of yeast can have a synergic effect in order to increase the ratio between A3MH and 3MH, and to produce very aromatic intense wines. Nutrition, very quickly. we have seen that ammonium is responsible of an inhibition of the entrance of precursors into the yeast. And you can see here experiments that show this mechanism. The addition of ammonium at the beginning of the fermentation lower drastically the 3-MH release. So it's very important for nutrition to afford to the yeast, to provide to the yeast organic nutrition, and at the very beginning of the fermentation. After fermentation, thiols are very reactive, 3 ways of degradation, complexation with copper and iron, non-reversible way, that is to say the addition of thiols onto quinons. It's not a direct oxidation, but an addition on an oxidation product, and the direct oxidation of thiols into disulfides. This reaction is a reversible reaction that can be reversed depending on the redox of the wine. So it could be considered that thiols and disulfides are an aromatic reserve that can be mobilizable during wine aging. You have obviously different tools in order to avoid the different degradation and loss of thiols. One of the most important or trendy in this time is the addition of glutathione throughout pure compounds or yeast derivatives that in fact is a competitor in terms of addition to the other thiols and that preserve thiols from the addition onto quinons. What is also important, and Michel Moutounet talked about this reaction, is that beside oxidation, you have also hydrolysis, and hydrolysis of A3MH is very important. The only tool very efficient is temperature and storage temperature, but we observe also that the use of manoproteins could also have the same effect than storage for months at low temperature. And you can see here the amplitude of preservation of A3MH throughout the addition of manoproteins. It's in the same order of magnitude than a storage for 1 year at 4 degrees. To conclude, a very complex pattern and multifactorial process, starting in the vineyard to pilot thiols. The things you have to, the take-home message is all along this process, all the lights must be on green. If you have one step wrong, you have the risk to annihilate all the effort made previously. Nitrogen yeast and yeast strain are very strong impact factors. And it's also very difficult to have a good balance between thiol and esters in the wines. So, because we have some antagonist effect in control factors. So, keep in mind that blending remains the ultimate and finest tool to adapt the wine to the market. But to have success in blending, you must have very different wine, and so favor the formation of one family in one tank, one aroma, another aroma family in the other tank, in order to have all the possibility of formulation for your different market. Thank you very much.